Well, good evening, and welcome to our last couple of episodes here of the story. As we come close to the end now, we are just about ready to move on to the last couple of chapters, and then a few more things. Uh, We have a chapter tonight, a chapter next week, and then I'm going to do one additional week, just to talk about generally. Hopefully tie some of all of this stuff together. So today we are at chapter 30 of our book, The Story, which is entitled Paul's Final Days. And frankly, as always, I'm sort of inclined to think differently about these chapter titles, because really this is about Paul's final trial. Much of Paul's life is this sort of trial of these challenges he faces, proclaiming the gospel, telling the story and what it means, and bringing people into their life of discipleship and helping them find their path. And so the last part here, and really here we are dealing with really in the book of Acts, chapters 20 to 28. When you read your part of the story, you will see also some material from some of a variety of the epistles as well. But really, the focus here in terms of just the timing of the material is that we should look at these last about the last third of the book of Acts, and it's a great narrative. It's really wide ranging. So it begins with Paul as he's traveling back through East Asia, modern day Turkey, and he's sort of making a kind of a farewell tour. He has set it in his mind that he's going to go to Jerusalem, and so he's stopping, and he passes by Ephesus, doesn't stop there, but they come out to meet him because of a riot that he had previously caused in Ephesus. But he comes there, he arrives in Jerusalem. He's welcomed by the followers there, but the rest of Jerusalem, not so much. And so they attack Paul, and they challenge him, and in this process, he tries to defend himself and to explain his teachings as well. But the mob rises up against him, and there's again general rioting going on as they're trying to kill Paul. And so the Roman troops step in to try to bring order. They capture Paul. They're about to have him flogged, but then it's revealed that he's a Roman citizen. So instead, he's arrested. He ends up in Caesarea under house arrest for a couple of years, and then there's a change of leadership, and then he is eventually sent to Rome to face the emperor, as is his right as a Roman citizen. This is that part of the story where Paul's Roman citizenship becomes sort of a saving grace for him. And so then he's brought to Rome. There's a shipwreck on his way to Rome, but he eventually gets there, and to the best of our knowledge, that's where Paul's story ends. There's a tradition that suggests that he also then went to Spain, but really no extant material to sort of back that idea up. All of which is to say, this long narrative is which is to say, the highlight of this is this moment when Paul is facing this mob in Jerusalem, and again, and facing the governor there, and facing all of these authorities there, and trying to explain himself. And there is a line in the midst of this in Acts chapter 23 where Paul says, "I am on trial concerning the hope of the resurrection of the dead." And in so many ways, it is this statement, this idea, this faith, the hope of the resurrection of the dead, that is the essence of what will always be Paul's trial for the rest of his life now. It has been for the entirety of his ministry, trying to help people understand, to preach, to teach, to lead by example what this idea of the resurrection of the dead is. Now this is the essential trial of faith, right? It is that we should come to believe in the resurrection of the dead, and what that means, and that should somehow shape our life and the way that we live. So let's spend a little bit of time, and we could be here for a while, but let's do it as quickly as we can, and just talk about that idea, right? Talk about that word first of all. The word resurrection, and this literally means to raise up. Is often used to refer to one who is crouching or lying down. It can also be used to mean to awaken or to institute or to install something, to set something up, to erect like pillars, and to repair. So it has this idea of, it has this kind of range of ideas and things that go with it. And it comes to Paul from a variety of things. Remember we talked last week about just Paul having all of these different sort of layers to himself and all of this different influences in his life. And obviously one of them is this Greek education. And much of the work that Paul does is to people, is to non-Jewish people. And resurrection is not a widespread idea in Greek philosophy. Plato talks a little bit about this idea of the transmigration of souls, the movement of souls from one plane of existence to another, but he uses a slightly different word there. But really, when we read Greek philosophers, we only hear about resurrection in a couple of ways. One is that it's impossible, that there's no such thing, or that it may happen as an isolated miracle. And so when Paul is speaking to Gentiles and talking to them about the idea of resurrection, well, that's kind of a strange idea for them. And not necessarily something that's going to immediately, oh yeah, resurrection of the dead, that's what we've been waiting for somebody to come and lead us to do. That's not how it goes. Now, obviously, when we talk theologically, that is specifically where we're headed, right? That is the end of the line for us, this idea of being raised from the dead or rising from death. That for us as Christians, and certainly for Paul in his writing, that's going to be kind of the key sort of teaching as well. But let's also remember that Paul is Jewish, right? And I said last week that I think that really is sort of a core part of the way we have to teach and understand Paul, is to really grasp his Jewish roots as well. And so when we look in the Hebrew Bible, there are a couple of examples of resurrections. In 1 Kings 17, Elijah raises the son of the widow of Zarephath from death, and his Elisha, who follows him, also raises a widow's son as well. There's this other kind of really fun story in Kings, in 2 Kings. It says this is after Elisha died, and they buried him. It says, now the bands of Moabites used to invade the land in the spring of the year. As a man was being buried, a marauding band was seen, and the man was thrown into the grave of Elisha. As soon as the man touched the bones of Elisha, he came to life and stood on his feet. Right, so there are some examples, some ideas again of this whole notion, and of course Elijah himself, right, doesn't die. There are two figures in the Old Testament who don't die. And that's Moses and Elijah. So those figures who remain alive, it's not because they died and were raised from the dead, right? They just never died. There just aren't figures of that. Until we get very, very late into the Hebrew Bible, very, very late into the Old Testament. And in some of the post-exilic materials now, we're going to start seeing this idea of a greater understanding of life. Not resurrection specifically from the dead, but the giving of life into those who are dead. And so, for example, in Ezekiel, right, the great prophecy about the dry bones, and here are these dead bones that are brought back to life, that are reanimated. And so too in Isaiah, in the third part of Isaiah, this idea of the suffering servant, right, this one who suffers and dies, but upon whom God bestows life as well. And then, of course, in Job, very late in the Old Testament, but this really well-known quote as well, for I know that my Redeemer lives, and at the last he will stand upon earth, and after my skin has been thus destroyed, then in my flesh I shall see God. Right? That really one of the very rare instances in the Hebrew Bible where there's a specific reference to a life after death, after my skin has been destroyed. But otherwise, it's very rare. Does not occur often. There are just hints of it as well. There's one other verse in Isaiah that's probably worth a peek at. In Isaiah chapter 26, it says, your dead shall live, their corpses shall rise. O dwellers in the dust, awake and sing for joy, for your dew is a radiant dew, and the earth will give birth to those long dead. So, for the community in exile, there were these beginning notions that were connected into their understanding of restoration, of their return to Jerusalem, that also went a little wider. It is worth noting, of course, that here's a community now living in Babylon. Here's a community deeply now becoming influenced by Persian teachings, which contain the idea of a life after death. Even the beginnings in Persian teachings of the idea of reincarnation. And it's hard to separate those influences out. Perhaps those ideas shape the way that Israel now is going to express its hope in its future as well. But it is important for us because it gives just some understanding of why this is a trial for Paul. That the idea of a resurrection of the dead, a life after death, is not widespread, is not deeply rooted in the community from which Paul comes and in the community to which Paul preaches. And so there's a lot of conflict there, right, that has to be kind of worked through. So we come to first century Judaism, right? We come to this time of Paul and his own life. And mostly the idea of messianism, the idea of the Messiah, is mostly dominated by, again, this idea of the literal restoration of the kingdom of Israel. So, for example, it's rejected by the Sadducees, rejected by the Samaritans. There's still just this notion of an actual physical revolution that will come and restore the Israelites to power and bring back in the quite literal, kingdom of David, a figure that will actually literally occupy the throne of David, that will overthrow the Romans and the other conquerors. So this notion of life after death is not widely held. There are some among the Pharisees, and Paul is a Pharisee, who have come to carry this idea of the resurrection of the dead. But even then, it's still not fully expressed and understood until we get to the Gospels, until we get to Jesus. Now, in the Gospels, we want to know that word is often used figuratively. It's not just used specifically or literally to describe resurrection from the dead or life after death. It's often just used, again, as this idea of being raised up. So, for example, there's a story in Mark where Jesus is healing a boy who is under the influence of demons. And so this is how the story ends. It says, Jesus said to this demonic spirit, "You spirit that keeps this boy from speaking and hearing, I command you, come out of him and never enter him again." After crying out and convulsing him terribly, it came out, and the boy was like a corpse, so that most of them said, "He is dead." But Jesus took him by the hand and lifted him up. There's the word for resurrection. And he was able to stand. So not just a given that the boy was dead and Jesus brought him back to life, but that word, that language, is used in this very figurative kind of sense as well. And it also appears in the story of the prodigal son, right, where the father of the prodigal son is explaining to the elder brother why we're having a party, and this is his response: because the son of mine was dead and he has come back to life. Now we know that the prodigal son was not literally dead, but dead in a very different kind of way, dead in the terms of separation, right? Dead in a sense of being lost in his purpose, and in that way, a very different kind of word than that kind of literal sense of dead. That being said, there are quite literal experiences of resurrection in the Gospels. Right? There are these specific examples. There are three of them. One is the daughter of the leader of the synagogue that appears in Mark chapter 5. One is the raising of the son of the widow of Nain in Luke chapter 7. And, of course, there is the story of the raising of Lazarus. Those specific, again, quite literal examples of being raised from death are part of the way that the word is used in the New Testament as well. Which then brings us to Jesus, right? It is specifically, of course, in the life of Jesus, in the Passion stories, that this then becomes the key. And Jesus predicts his own resurrection 3 times in all of the Gospels. Then Jesus began to teach them that the Son of Man must undergo great suffering and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, and be killed, and on the 3rd day be raised again. Right? This is at the core of how Jesus leads the disciples, this idea that they need to come to understand. And of course, what we don't want to miss about that is that while Jesus tells them this multiple times and is quite clear, frank in his language, the disciples never get it. A reminder that, again, that this idea is not just commonplace. It's not normal. It's not a part of the way that the people understand God, not the part of the way that the people practice faith. That first you die and then you're resurrected and then you come back to life. And certainly the idea of going to heaven after death is not typical or normal of the way the faith is practiced in those days. So along comes Jesus with this very different idea, right? That the seeds are planted in that time, but it is not by any means a given until it actually happens. And then suddenly everything is new, right? Everything is different. Suddenly here is this new reality, the resurrected Jesus, who appears both in bodily form for the 50 days following, the 40 days following Easter, and then how that idea then shapes the way that the Christian community will understand not just who Jesus is, but who they are and how they are to practice their faith. Want to bring you back and remind you again of one thing that we've talked about before, that for most of the early Christians, there was this very concrete understanding that Jesus would return immediately, that in their lifetimes they would see him come back. And so the idea of resurrection also is shaped by time, right? By this duration. What does it mean that Jesus does not come back from the dead right away? And then how does that promise of a resurrection that still lies ahead shape the way that we practice faith? So in the book of Acts, the idea of Jesus being raised from the dead is dominant. Dominant in the way that the story is told, dominant in the way that the apostles, beginning with Peter here at Pentecost, proclaim the story, right? This man, as Peter's referring to Jesus, handed over to you according to the definite plan and foreknowledge of God, you crucified and killed by the hands of those outside the law, but God raised him up. Right? That at the core of their understanding of Jesus, the core of this witness is this understanding that who Jesus is he is the one whom God raised from death. Of all of the ways they will bear witness to Jesus, that will be their primary understanding, that Jesus was crucified and God raised him from the dead. And in all of the ways and in all of the layers of understanding and meaning that will be then applied to that idea, that's the core reality of that. How the church interpreted it, both in those early days and how we do still now, is the primary question of doctrine, of faith, of theology. So in the letter to the Corinthians, Paul gets into this in the 15th chapter and comes to this sort of a final conclusion, right? If Christ has not been raised, by the way, notice that he uses the present tense, has not been raised, the perfect tense there, not past tense. Your faith is futile. And he also uses the language of your faith is vain then, right? Your faith doesn't matter. Your faith is meaningless. Your faith is empty and hollow. That this reality of resurrection is what gives shape and structure and purpose to our faith in Jesus. I mean, we move from a particular understanding of the covenant that is shaped by these sort of daily acts. And Paul, not Paul nor the early apostolic community throws that idea away. They still believe, as they did prior, that faith has to mean something, has to do something. It has to somehow show forth who God is in the way that we live and act every single day. But now what we're showing forth is this very specific understanding of God that includes this idea of resurrection, right? This very specific understanding that God is not just the God of the Hebrew Bible who stood apart, but now God has brought this new reality of life into ourselves. And so we are more now than just what we seem. And somehow we have moved from this idea of you get one life, do the best you can to, now you get one resurrected life. And what does do the best you can mean to people who are living out the resurrection? This is, I think, the great sort of challenge of faith. And one of the things I tried to say in last week's lesson is try to give you some sense of that Paul's thought is much more diverse than we make it out to be. It has always been the struggle of the proclamation of the church to have a wholeness to the way that we teach and preach, to not just say one thing, oh, you live a good life, and if you live a good life, then when you die, you get to go to heaven, but to have a wholeness to life, and to understand that this idea of resurrection is real in the here and now. So when I think about Paul's sort of final trial, about the real test of Paul's preaching, I think about these words, this question for us, right? Why is resurrection central to faith? What is it about resurrection that actually helps us understand what faith is, that shows us the path of life, that gives our life meaning and hope? And again, for the early community, as they're now wrestling with both a new understanding of what it is that Jesus was the Messiah, and a new understanding of what it means to live waiting for his return, suddenly this idea of resurrection is not just a later question, it becomes a now question. I think that brings us really to our own sort of moment now, right? How do we understand what it means to be a follower of Jesus? I mean, it's more than just he taught us some things. It's more than just the wisdom. It's more than just the rules of behavior. It's this one word, resurrection, that is the core and centrality of what it is that we believe. That we are more than what meets the eye. That we are also lifted up, even in the midst of this life. And that this promise changes us, transforms us. When Paul gets in this conversation here at the end of Corinthians, he has this long sort of listing of all of the appearances of Jesus after the resurrection, after Easter, and he connects this idea of the resurrected body of Christ to the actual body of Christ that is the community of faith in the world, and invites the community of faith to model itself after the resurrected Christ, right? To model itself after this new being, this unheard of idea, this brand new thing. So we carry that faith out into the world with that same sort of question. How do we live out as the resurrected body of Christ in the world? How do we bring the fullness of life into this world, into the things that we say and do, so that it's not just a vain existence, but that it is a real thing? Every day we, like Paul, are on trial because we hope in a resurrection. We live in a world that believes in death. We live in a world that believes in limitations. We live in a world that is okay with suffering and injustice. Those are not the products of resurrection. Those are things that work against life. If we would, like Paul, face this trial, face this challenge, then we must also then put our faith in the resurrection on the line every single day. Next week, the last part, we will look at the last book of the Bible, the book of Revelations, a highly misunderstood and misused book that contains a really, really important way to wrap up what it is that the whole of the Word of God is actually kind of about. I'll give you a little challenge to last week. I think the book of Revelation can be summed up into 2 words. We'll see if you can figure out what those 2 words are before we get to next week. So join me again next Wednesday evening at 6 o'clock as we find our way to the end of the story. Have a great day.